All right, so I'm your left wing host, Brittany. This is your right wing host, Todd. How are you?
Doing great, Britt. How are you?
Doing good. All right, so we got an interview for you guys. The purpose of our interviews is to bring people on who are interested in doing debates or panels, find out where they stand on various issues, what they would be the most interested in debating, and then we use these to match them up with other debaters. We're doing something new for content creators or people who have been on our show. We will do these live. Before we were not doing them live because you just don't know who you're going to get, you don't know if it's going to work, so it's easier to just or people who record them and then add them to our library after. We have our libraries all on YouTube. There's a left-wing debaters library and a right-wing debaters library. We also have a panelist library as well, but that's more for people who are just like not quite ready to do a one-on-one debate. Maybe they want to start off on panels and work their way up to debates, or maybe their positions aren't really firm enough where a debate's a good fit, but they still want to be a part of the conversation. But anybody that's in our library of debaters, they are interested in doing debates. So you guys can go scroll through them, see if anybody sparks your interest, let us know, we can set that up. And if you want to be added to that library, you can email us at politicallyprovoked@gmail.com. And we also do plan on doing a written version of the library where we'll have all of our debaters, the topics that are the most interested in debating, and a link to their interview. So that might be an easier way for you guys to kind of go through them. All right, so we got an interview today with Rose Wrist. How are you?
Hello, I'm doing phenomenally. How about yourself?
Doing good. So yeah, if you want to introduce yourself, tell people where you lie on the political spectrum and where people can find you.
Yep, my name is Roserist. I'm a progressive content creator based in Sweden, so I talk a bit more about European politics than most people do, but obviously I still talk about the US stuff going on and stuff from a global politics perspective as well. Socially, I am progressive and I lean progressive on pretty much all issues. Economically, I define myself as a social democrat or social democratic, and you can find all my stuff by just typing Roserist and any media, platform, basically Twitch, YouTube, Twitter, and yeah, I have a YouTube called Roses as well, where I upload videos every day except for Sundays, and I stream Sundays and Tuesdays and Thursdays as well. So there's something going on every day pretty much. But yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yeah. What was the first debate where you found us?
Um, I heard about you guys mostly from debates that Destiny had, some debates that Mouthy Infidel had, and there was some on LGBT debates, and then a couple on immigration that I tune into, and that's how I heard about Politically Provoked.
And if you were to debate somebody, which topics would interest you the most and which topics would interest you the least?
Mostly any sort of pressing social issue I think is pretty interesting, except for critical race theory. I find that to be really, really boring and to be a really overblown topic. But stuff like systemic racism I think is super interesting. Immigration is super interesting. Debates on general economics, privatization, having things publicly run, especially in stuff like education, I think is super interesting because it's one of the things I care the most about. Other social issues like the validity of transgender people and the type of care that they should be given in society, I also think is something that is interesting and something that I talk about a lot. But yeah, I am pretty much open to debating most commonly discussed topics on the internet.
Which topics are you the least interested in?
It would probably be like critical race theory and then more niche discussions on like small specific actions or current event discussions I often find fairly, like hard to get into, especially if it's something that you still have really, important information coming out. So stuff on breaking news, for instance, I don't find it super interesting to debate or discuss or stuff like that. But for most topics, as long as it's something that is fairly common or yeah, something that's not really far out of the ordinary, I'm going to be interested in debate.
Okay. And if you could name one public figure, could be a politician, could be somebody famous, somebody online, that's the closest to your views, who would that be?
Typically, if I were to name a real politician, I would say somewhere along sort of the Bernie Sanders progressive left wing of the United States politics. When it comes to online stuff, I am in a similar like political vein of, for example, like Vosh or Destiny or those types of people. And there's a lot of shared beliefs between the type of progressive internet online debating sphere where I would say that I fall in there.
So you said you're from Sweden. A lot of our questions are kind of designed towards American politics, but you said you follow American politics pretty closely, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, one question that we ask is what the number one threat facing America is, but I guess we can ask you what you think the number one threat facing the world is.
Yeah, I mean, I could answer, all 3 points really: America, the world, and Sweden. I would say
Okay.
in America, the number one issue that people face right now is just the complete divide between what realities people are existing in. Due to the spread of alternative media and the increased political polarization of the United States, an increasing, or a struggle that is becoming increasingly apparent that needs to be resolved before any other major project or progress can be made is the fight of information and how divided and how a lot of people live in separate realities, because there's no way we could ever solve large issues without even agreeing that they are the issues, or without agreeing on like a set of information or data or statistics about said issues. So that would be the number one thing for the United States. For the world as a whole, I would say the greatest thing that we need to do and the greatest problem we have to overcome is the lack of some very needed international cooperation when it comes for example, economic trade, when it comes to our labor rights, and especially when it comes to climate change. We need to see more united global action when it comes to dealing with these issues, and that's something that we desperately need and that we're missing right now. When it comes to Sweden specifically, we have seen a massive rise of populist far right, politicians and sentiment across the country. Most of it stemming from issues we had with our public infrastructure following the 2015 immigration crisis. So we need to resolve those issues we have within our public infrastructure, get our integration going really well, and part of that is really building up the public infrastructure that we had in Sweden that has been falling apart over the past few decades. So that'll be my answer to those three.
Okay. I just want to address this question. Have you debated Sean last?
Oh, I have debated Sean last. Actually, it was back in December. We could do that. The debate that we had there was one on race realism, and it was a big thing there. And at the end of the day, what ended up happening is that me and my debate partner then spent months and months reading on all these niche information that you need to know for having debates on race realism. And then we showed up to the debate. One of the people just didn't show because they said that they were busy hanging up Christmas lights during the entire debate. So it's a bit weird. And then generally the debate was just really, really low level. You had opponents not reading the abstract of the stuff that they were citing and all sorts of other issues. But maybe if Sean Lass would like to do a debate on a less niche topic that requires a lot less often, unnecessary preparation before it, such as, for instance, the dealing of social issues or systemic racism or something, I would be interested in doing that.
I know he likes to debate. He actually has a debate with Stardust on Sunday, I believe, on systemic racism. But yeah, maybe we can get you matched up with him for systemic racism as well at some point.
Yeah, sounds interesting.
Cool. All right. So, what kind of healthcare system exactly do you guys have in Sweden?
So we have almost an like entirely publicly run system. We have a few private hospitals, but for most types of care, it's publicly funded, so it's free for the average citizen. Well, for paying taxes, but yeah.
Right. And it's like a two-tier system, basically?
Yeah, sort of.
Okay. Where do you get your news from?
Where I typically get my news from, it's a wide range of different sources. So I have a set of Swedish newspapers and publications which I follow, that being the more mainstream ones. Swedish audience members may recognize like Aftonbladet, Expressen, SVT as generally pretty good news sources. In Sweden, we have really good public service programs, which is lacking in a lot of other countries, and they're really good for giving you a more unbiased and broad perspective on most issues going on nationally. When it comes for things that have to do with the United States or other countries, most larger, news companies or news institutions, you have the CNN, you have the MSNBC, you have more sort of like progressive types of media outlets, I think Democracy Now, and a whole lot of others, which I engage in, and I take in, any like more popular articles that they put out about different topics, and take a look at those and weigh them with each other. And it's a wide range of different sources there. And then of course the information I ran into doing what I do, doing streaming debates and discussions and watching videos and stuff like that, in which it sort of inspires me to go from there and do my own reading into the source material that is being quoted.
Okay. And what's been your experience with social media? Do you think it's had a more positive effect on the world or negative?
For specifically political discourse, I think social media like Twitter has absolutely decimated the quality that we have online. But I think that social media can have a wonderful potential for good, and I think that's something that we need a more nuanced perspective at, because you will often have people right now hailing it as the greatest thing in the world with no negatives, or people on the other side saying that every second you spend on social media like shortens your lifespan or makes you immediately depressed or whatever. From what research tends to indicate when it comes to the state of discourse and when it comes to people's well-being, as long as you have a balanced and a healthy relationship with social media, there are a lot of positives when it comes to your ability to be connected with other people and to learn more. However, if the relationship becomes unhealthy, then it will have negative effects, obviously. And there are a bunch of different structures and pressures within the social media apps that sort of push us towards an unhealthy relationship with it, which need to be resolved. But yeah, I think it's a balanced issue. It can be really good if we engage with it responsibly, or it could be bad if it's engaged with irresponsibly.
Okay. Do you think it's ever appropriate to dox someone? And if so, what line should we cross that warrants it?
I would say generally, when it comes to discussions and stuff like this is happening on the internet, it's probably not a good idea to do so if it is something that is necessary for the prevention of like a serious crime or a terrorist attack or something. Then yeah, it's probably a good idea. But typically, I tend to lean on the side that we should try to avoid doxing, both because there is a massive potential for it to be used in the incorrect way and for people to begin doxing people more liberally. In addition to that, it makes, the people that do it, which may otherwise maybe have decent beliefs or whatever, look absolutely crazy, and just generally doesn't seem like a good hill to begin climbing.
All right, so we're gonna go into some social issues. That's cool. Do you think it's transphobic to not be attracted to transgender people?
That depends on why you're not attracted to transgender people. If you just have certain, preferences that don't stem from transphobia, then yeah, sure, no worries. There's no issues with that. But if, for example, your reasons for not liking transgender people is because all transgender people are like icky and they're like, sexual predators and stuff like that, then yeah, that's probably transphobic. So it's not really the fact that you don't like or find them attractive that is transphobic. It has more to do with what the reason behind that is, which the only way to establish that would be through introspection. And yes, it's a complicated issue.
Okay. Do you think that trans women should be allowed to play in women's sports?
I think that the research right now tends to indicate that after a certain point of the transition, there doesn't seem to be a competitive advantage incurred within transgender athletes competing in women's sports. However, exactly what this line is still needs more research on it. Obviously, there seems to be some concerns all from the perspective of somebody who has just, come to terms with their trans identity, immediately switching sports categories. But it seems right now that, hey, once it gets to the point where the data seems to suggest that there isn't like an extraordinary competitive advantage, then it should be fine.
Do you think that religion is a justifiable excuse to not serve people in the LGBTQ community?
That would be depending on what type of service it is. If it is anything that is, like broad or necessary, if it's something like, for example, healthcare or any other like educational service that is necessary for other citizens, then pretty much never. The only situations I can see for this is very, very niche examples of, like free market or private enterprises who offer, niche non-essential services in which they're obviously allowed to do as they wish legally with their given firm. But for the majority of cases that are significant, then no, you shouldn't be able to discriminate against LGBT people on the basis of a religion, as long as it conflicts with protected classes.
Do you think that being transgender or gay is a choice? Do you think that there's environmental factors that can influence it?
I think that if it was a choice, nobody would pick to be gay or trans, because why would you deal with the a million ways in which they are treated more harshly, in which they're discriminated against, in which they're subjected to more violence if it was just simply a choice that you could opt in or opt out of? So no, the research seems to suggest, and just logically doesn't make sense for it to be a choice by any means. There may be some environmental factors that have influences on that, but notably, just because there may be environmental influences on a certain individual's behavior or identity doesn't mean that this is just something that can be, taken away or can be sort of like uninfluenced in a simple fashion. So yeah, it's not a choice. There may be some environmental influences, but they probably wouldn't be significant enough to deem the whole, being LGBT as a choice by any means.
Okay. Do you think there's such thing as white privilege?
I think a more effective way of framing the issue of white privilege is talking more about minority disprivilege or minority penalties. There are a wide range of penalties that minority groups face in the United States of America and in the world as a whole, and because of that, white people who tend to not have the same amount of penalties tend to be relatively privileged, but focusing on the privilege aspect doesn't seem productive because we really want everybody to attain the type of status that white people are able to attain in society when it comes to privileges and disprivileges. So it seems to make more sense to focus on the disprivileges that minority groups face in society. So yes, I would agree with the concepts that white people relatively have advantages in society and they relatively have privileges, but I think a more effective and accurate way of framing it would be focusing on minority disprivileges.
So I'm guessing since you said systemic racism would be one of the topics that you would be interested in debating, what's your stance on that?
I think systemic racism, or I know systemic racism absolutely exists. Now, it is important to note that we can break this down in a lot of different ways. There is a really easy argument to be made here, which is that, hey, racist treatment in the past has led to massive wealth gaps, which have a whole range of negative effects on individuals' well-being. Wealth is one of the best predictors for your quality of life, for your success in life. And if there were massive discrepancies that were born out of racist treatment that have still not been addressed, and people today, minority groups today, are still facing the consequences of that, that'd be an example of systemic racism. But then in addition to that, there also seems to be a number of factors today that continuously push to largen that gap exclusively on the basis of race without necessarily having much to do with economics. So for instance, studies on your name in job interviews tend to suggest that there is a very specific, exclusively racial component to it that doesn't have much to do with social class. So I think it's a combination of these two different facets, the issues in the past that haven't been addressed, and the pressures that exist right now that are further trying to widen this gap that make up what we define as systemic racism.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna do a lightning round, then I'm gonna hand it to Todd, and then we can see what people in the audience if they want to ask some questions. So, healthcare, privilege or right?
Lean more on right.
Climate change, man-made or hoax?
Absolutely man-made and real.
Well, the electoral college, I guess you wouldn't really. I mean, do you have opinions on the electoral college?
I think that it's generally undemocratic, and if I had the choice, I would abolish it.
Okay. Yes, a bunch of these are actually designed for America. I can ask you anyways, but defund the police, support or oppose?
It really depends on what you mean by defund the police, because there's about 6 million different interpretations of that. If we're in favor of reallocating the funding that we have for police departments right now, and in different directions, so moving maybe some funding to different social programs while putting more funding in, for example, training programs for police officers, yep, all on board. We need to change the way we fund police.
Okay. Tax the rich more or less?
More.
Legalize all drugs, support or oppose?
Legalize all drugs when the time comes. It differs on a country's economic state and development.
Legalize prostitution, support or oppose?
Support, again, for most countries depending on their level of development.
Death penalty, support or oppose?
Oppose.
All right, Todd, do you want to hop in?
Yeah, and again, these questions are American, but answer them for all three like you did. You can do, of course, America first, then Sweden, then the world, or whatever order you want. So my first question is about nationalism, and what is your take on nationalism, or do you favor globalism? Which one do you find to be superior? And like I said, answer it from all three perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I am a massive fan of globalism, both for the US, for Sweden, and the world as a whole. I believe that globalism, the rise of international trade, the increased interconnectedness between different nations and different peoples can have phenomenal effects on our quality of life, on our economic development, on our human development as a sort of species on this planet, I suppose. Now, while I am in favor of globalism because of all the positives, it is also important to recognize that there are certain groups that are hurt by globalism. And those groups need to be taken into account and need to be compensated for the negatives that they might specifically experience. So for instance, a lot of people who work in manufacturing sectors may be hurt for globalism, which tends to be the case, right? The more you enter a globalized economy, the more productive efficiency is going to maximize throughout the different nations who are trading with one another. And there tends to be countries that can do manufacturing for a lot cheaper than what a lot of people in the developing nations can. So what does this mean? Well, we do garner a lot of economic positives from our trade that seem to increase the amount of wealth in the country, our ability to build wealth and GDP and all the rest of it, while harming small groups of the population. So what needs to be done is that portions of the extra benefits that we're getting from globalism needs to be funneled specifically towards projects for alleviating the slight negatives that come with globalism, to ensure that we are maximizing our positives and minimizing our negatives.
Okay, great. Question number 2 is about hate speech. So, of course, we know the American perspective, but give it to me from, Europe too, because I was seeing where people, if you basically even share a meme that's unpopular in Europe, or if you intentionally misgender someone of trans persuasion, you will go to jail. So, explain it to me from America and the whole world in your place. Thank you.
Yeah, so Europe has a bit more of a non-absolutist stance. Well, no country is really absolutist in free speech, but has a less liberal stance of free speech than what the US does. It's not quite as bad as a lot of the conservatives in the US will make it out to seem, as in, like, you will be arrested and thrown in jail for the smallest of things, or have been some particularly egregious examples. So, for instance, Count Dankula should probably not have been thrown in jail for teaching his pug to do like a Nazi salute or whatever. But there is a lot more of a restrictions on freedom of speech in Europe compared to the US. There was a second part of your question there. You mentioned the spreading of memes, and then there was something else that I wanted to bring up that I forgot what that was.
Intentional misgendering.
Right.
Intentional misgendering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when it comes to the misgendering thing, typically, if you continuously intentionally misgender someone, it's not really the fact that you just misgendered somebody that has now become the core reason why you might get locked up or persecuted for that. Obviously, it would depend on the context in which it's done. So, for instance, if it happens within a workplace, then it would count as like workplace harassment, in which case that can incur, obviously, like criminal justice penalties for that, just like we wouldn't expect or we wouldn't tolerate expressions of racism within the workplace. We shouldn't tolerate expressions of transphobia. This is even true for the US when it comes to the implementation of protected classes. Bill C-16 in Canada, which all it really did was just move trans individuals into protected classes that already existed within Canada. And then if it's happening in like a non-workplace environment, obviously if it's continuous and intentional, then it's more like just like public harassment of an individual, right? It doesn't really matter the fact that it's, like misgendering necessarily. If you just walked around somebody, if you just continually like berated somebody with a condescending statement or a malicious statement in public, regardless of what it was, you would probably face some forms of consequences for that. And misgendering an individual is certainly, especially intentionally, is certainly a malicious act that has been demonstrated to have very harmful effects on the well-being of that individual. So yeah, it's a bit stricter in Europe compared to the US. However, it's not the worlds apart that people will make it out to seem. Generally, I lean in favor more of, for example, like hate speech and stuff like that. Those laws shouldn't be as like strict. They should be more liberal. So I'm sort of like in between the positions of US or countries like the UK, for example, somewhere down there in the middle.
All right, thank you. Number 3 is about guns. Sometimes I find that when we're talking to people from outside of America, we come off as crazy gun nuts. So, what is your stance on guns? Do you think that America has a gun problem? And what is your country's policy on guns?
Yeah, so in Sweden, just like in most other countries, there are heavy regulations and restrictions for gun ownership and spread of guns. And you were a bit on the money there in that a lot of Europeans, including myself, think that America's a bit too gun crazy, right? There seems to be a number of negatives that are associated with widespread gun ownership in society. Now, it is important to note that these negatives are drastically amplified by other underlying social issues, such as, for instance, poor cultural attitudes when it comes to the usage and the ownership of firearms, when it comes to mental health issues, when it comes to issues related to, prescription medications and stuff like that. However, regardless of those underlying issues, the fact that people are able to express the symptoms of these underlying issues through the use of guns, which is a force amplifier, necessarily increases the amount of potential harm that can be conducted as an effect of those underlying conditions. So let's say that you have, two different countries in which there are still, Republicans will talk about this a lot, people that are just evil, right? People that will take whatever means that they can in order to enact the most violence or harm as possible upon the world. Now, in one of these societies, it's easier to get guns, and in one of the societies, it's hard to get guns. And there's a reason why guns are used in the military, right? It's because it's a really effective way of being able to distribute violence. And as an effect of that, because it is harder to get a gun in other places, the potential output of harm in those countries tends to be a lot lower than in the US. And even when it comes to self or harm directed at the self, when it comes to, for example, suicide and self-harm and stuff like that, if you have access to a firearm, your likelihood of being able to successfully engage in an attempt of suicide is a lot higher, obviously, than if you don't have easy access to a gun. So a lot of people tend to bring up, oh, well, this isn't with guns. Most of the violence has to do with it being inflicted upon the self. Well, it's still the gun's fault, right? Because it gives you an easier tool by which to take your own life. And as such, it's easier for you to be able to you basically utilize the weapon in order to engage in more harm with society. And this has been proven empirically as well, both when it comes to violence directed at other people and violence directed at the self. So generally, I'm in favor of gun control, and I think that it is better for a society if you limit the access of guns from what the US has now, for instance. But it's a difficult topic when it comes to the US, specifically in how you do that. That's a killer question in the US.
All right. Next one is the pro-life and pro-choice one. So are you pro-life or pro-choice? And when do you feel life begins? And do you even have abortions where you're at in Sweden?
We absolutely have access to legal abortions in Sweden. Now, there are a bunch of different aspects to the questions you mentioned. So when does life begin? Well, if we talk about the concept of contraception and, pregnancy and stuff like that, technically, the life begins at the sperm and the egg, right? And then through conception, there is further development. But even if we do recognize that life begins at conception or even earlier than that, that in itself is actually completely unrelated to the topic of, whether or not we should be pro-life or pro-choice. Because we do recognize as a society that all life isn't worth protecting at all times. Otherwise, we would have a lot, stricter laws and regulations when it comes to people's ability to enact harm on other living things, such as, for example, nature or animals or stuff like that. The key question here is, when do we consider somebody a human? That seems to be the more sort of pertinent aspect of discussion when it comes to talking about pro-life or pro-choice. And personally, from my understanding and from my perspective and what I think is easiest to justify, it seems like we should begin valuing a human's experience and a human's well-being at the point in which we can reasonably assume that it's beginning to have a conscious experience. Because there's no point of protecting something that doesn't have a conscious experience, because there isn't really anything to protect there in the first place. So for me personally, I would say that the point at which you should consider something as a human life would be at the time it develops a conscious experience. So that's the sort of answer to the life question. But generally, I absolutely fall pro-choice when it comes to people's access to abortion. The question of when human life begins is one, and then there are also other questions about the outcomes of having access to abortions in society, which is separate from that as well. So yeah, overall, I'm pro-choice.
Okay, and then the last part I like to go over is immigration. So, and I do want to kind of ask you something about Sweden, but we'll start with America first. So, do you think that America should just take undocumented and undocumented, an unspecific amount of undocumented workers? And do you think America should be open borders with the southern border with Mexico?
I think that typically we should all aim our very best to reduce undocumented immigration as a whole. Now, the solution to reducing this isn't, putting up, 7 feet tall metal walls that electrocute people when they touch them around your entire borders. The solution to that is by making the legal processes easier to engage with. The reasons why undocumented immigration tends to be that bad is because, number one, you have no records of this person's existence within your country. You have no really way to contact them. There's no registry of them existing. They might be exempt from certain social obligations, like certain types of paying taxes. They might also not be able to take advantage of certain social structures that we all deem is necessary for humans existing within the 21st century on account for that. And just typically, we should try to minimize the likelihood of having undocumented immigrants within a country by increasing the likelihood of them being able to go through the legal channels instead. So generally, I'm in favor of immigration. I want there to be a wider and easier accessibility of legal immigration, specifically in the context of the US. It's very hard for me to say what the effects would be if the US just completely opened the borders to, like from south of the border. So that seems to be a bit of a very radical step to take at the beginning. However, I can say with certainty that US can certainly loosen up its immigration laws as they exist today, because right now there doesn't seem to be any really significant negative effects from immigration when it comes to economics, when it comes to crime, when it comes to, social cohesion. There doesn't really seem to be these massive significant negative outcomes of immigration, so it should stand to reason that they can probably loosen things up quite a bit from where they are right now.
Okay, now I would like you to go into Sweden, because I've heard a bunch of stuff, and I don't know whether it's true or whether it's not true, because I don't know what's reputable. Besides Reuters, I don't know what the global media is. So, is there a problem in Sweden with immigration, and is there such a thing as no-go zones? And is this true? Am I reading stuff wrong? What's the deal with Sweden's immigration, please?
Yeah, so Sweden is the example everyone will bring up as, as proof of that immigration doesn't work. But you will notice that excessively many people, including Swedes, have no idea about any of the underlying effects. So, for instance, we can talk about the no-go zones for just a minute. No-go zones, as the name implies, don't exist in Sweden. What we do have in Sweden is what we call utsatta områden and mer utsatta områden. Basically, regions that are vulnerable is what that sort of translates into. And this basically means regions that have, low job opportunities, that tend to have higher rates of crime, and that generally are in a socioeconomically worse position. By no-go, this does not mean that the police don't go in these areas. It does not mean that Sweden doesn't have jurisdiction over these areas, as I've heard a number of, right-wing conservative commentators claim. It just means that these are areas that have expressly poor socioeconomic conditions. If Sweden were to apply its, legislative framework and titling in the US, there'd be a large number of so-called no-go zones in the US as well. So it's by no means something that is exclusive to Sweden. It's just vulnerable areas. When it comes to issues relating to immigration in Sweden, the very short side of the story would be that during 2015, Sweden made a very sort of humanitarian policy of being able to take in a lot of extremely, hurt people that are in extremely bad positions following the circumstances that led to the Syrian refugee crisis. And I think this is something that is a very moral thing for Sweden to do, right? To be able to take in these individuals. Now, in Sweden, we have seen for the past few decades preceding that event a really strong sort of disassembly of really important public infrastructure systems that we have. For instance, our healthcare and our education systems have been decimated by a lot of privatization that was made in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And it is of my belief, and of the belief of most of the literature that exists right now, that Sweden is perfectly capable of being able to properly integrate and ensure that we don't have issues in relation to unemployment and crime from the existing immigrant population, as long as we fix those issues of public infrastructure that we have right now in Sweden. It is absolutely possible. And the real issue here and the real cause behind the issues that we have in relation to immigration doesn't really have anything to do with the amount or the type of immigrants or refugees we took in, as much as it does us having issues with the public infrastructure in Sweden that we should have fixed long ago anyways, regardless of whether or not we decide to take in a lot of immigrants or refugees in Sweden. So yeah, typically what we have to do is we have to rebuild our public infrastructure in Sweden, and we will have a, severely and a significantly different situation when it comes to immigration than what we have right now.
All right, thank you. And then just give me a letter grade for Joe Biden so far. What do you think?
I think Joe Biden's doing pretty good stuff. I would say a B. Like a strong B, probably B plus or something. I think he's doing a lot better job than I would have expected. He's done a few really interesting stuff. His infrastructure bill looks really good. His COVID relief package was really good. The other types of policies that he has right now on the table when it comes to police reform seem very interesting. And overall, he seems to have a lot more of a, an impact and a progressive effect than what a lot of people would have expected him to have. So I think that he's doing a pretty good job, not to even mention, the treatment and the handling of the coronavirus, when he has inherited such a divided and misinformed country from, President Trump previously. I think he's done a pretty good job, and I'm impressed with his performance so far. Obviously, you can still do better, absolutely, and I will keep, arguing for the fact that he should do better. But yeah, I think he's done a pretty good job.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it back to Brittany. Thanks for popping on with us.
Yeah, so I think we have like one question. If you guys have any other questions, just tag politically provoked, and we can do it if you get to it after I'm done reading this. Otherwise, we will shut it down. So I guess from Vexner, would you ever call someone you disagreed with a white supremacist or Nazi before knowing what their opinions are? Would you say they're secret Nazis?
No. It's probably not a good idea to call people things that you don't know what their real political beliefs are. I am in favor of calling people who do exhibit white supremacists and Nazi belief Nazis and white supremacists to really ensure that people have an understanding of what these beliefs really are. Obviously, that label is not an argument, but it's an effective way of labeling people to make people understand what's going on. But yeah, don't label people stuff if you don't know what they are. It just makes you look really dumb, and you probably could be wrong as well. So don't do that.
Do you think that white supremacists and Nazis should be able to have a platform to speak as well, or do you think that they should have their platforms removed?
I think it's fine. You could probably have a platform. I think that the key issue when it comes to whether or not they could have a platform that disproportionately affects people who tend to be Nazis and white supremacists tends to be your likelihood of engaging with facts and not misinforming people. Misinformation and intentionally being like bad faith and trying to spread, like information or narratives that are just patently untrue, that I think should be discouraged and should be deplatformed as much as possible. And this will probably disproportionately affect Nazis and white supremacists because their ideology is dog shit. But if you are a Nazi or white supremacist, as long as you try your best to stick to not misinforming people, which can be really hard for those people, it's fine. But as long as you do that, then you're gone.
Okay. Western Artifact said, when you said Sean Last didn't read the abstract, could you elaborate how his argument failed?
So this was specifically in regards to something we had going on at the very end of our debate, which was a more productive way of holding a discussion, I think. And it's based on an even if argument, right? Which is, okay, even if you, Sean Last, were to be completely correct on this race and IQ stuff, how is that a counter argument towards the elimination of very real pressures and examples of systemic racism that we see existing right now? Just because there may be group differences in people's like maximum potential or whatever, that by no means means that we shouldn't try to maximize an individual's potential based on what they're able to do. And then we went there a little bit, and we ended up getting to a point where Sean Last said that like family income or your wealth actually doesn't have any predictor or doesn't predict at all the wealth of like a child, or there is no causative effect there. And then he linked something, and when linking that, it very clearly said that, hey, there is a strong like causal effect in regards to the income of your parents compared to the income of their offspring, which was just pretty funny. But yeah, it's like it's scientific consensus, so it's not like a hyper specific thing he tripped up on this abstract. It's just him not reading the abstract and also not being familiar with really easy and common scientific consensus on the topic of wealth distribution.
Okay. And some Earthman Brick, are you familiar with the holometer? Am I saying that right? Where you taught it at school?
It was covered a bit, yeah, during the education on the USSR that we were given, and yeah, Holodomor, not good, probably a genocide. Yeah. We didn't go like super in depth into it. Obviously, it's one of the things that especially like far left people like tankies would like to bring up a lot. They want to discuss on whether or not Holodomor was actually a genocide when it's an overblown point. So yeah, I mean we covered it briefly in school, but yeah, not nearly as much as people like to talk about on the internet.
From Base Moon, couldn't people just as easily commit suicide with all the drugs that you would want to legalize as they could with a gun?
That is a really good concern. However, if you were to make that statement, I would ask you to provide information that seems to be the case. And we can know that empirically, access to guns tends to increase suicide rates. But we can see from other empirical data we have of countries which have experimented on more legalization and decriminalization that the rates of overdose decrease, the rates of people voluntarily checking themselves into rehab increase, the likelihood of people being able to come back from, let's say, criminal endeavors involving drugs and live a healthy life afterwards dramatically increase, amount of abusive drug use decreases, And it just seems to empirically be the case that if you have a good approach to legalizing and decriminalizing drugs, as well as having a shifted perspective on how you view it as more of a medical issue rather than a legal issue from a societal perspective, it seems to have positive effects that aren't reminiscent of the effects guns have on people's suicidality.
Okay, I think we might be caught up. So if there's anything that we didn't address that you want to, the floor is yours.
I think that about, covers the main things that I had in mind to talk about.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, if you guys are interested in debating Rose, let us know so we can set that up. Other than that, I guess we will see you later, people. Good night, guys.